It all started with a question I never thought I'd hear from Mike, my best friend of 15 years. We were sitting at the bar we'd been going to since our college days, nursing a couple of beers after work. The conversation was light sports, work drama, and plans for the weekend until he dropped it like a bomb. "James," he said, swirling the beer in his glass and avoiding eye contact. "If you found out Samantha was keeping something from you, would you want to know?" The words hit me like a sucker punch. I put my drink down and stared at him. "What the hell does that mean?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. Mike sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked guilty, uncomfortable, and like he wanted to be anywhere but sitting across from me. "I've been hearing things," he said slowly. "Stuff about Sam. About how she's been spending her time lately." I felt my stomach tighten. "What kind of things?" He hesitated. "I don't want to say too much without knowing for sure. But if I were you, I'd pay closer attention to what she's doing when you're not around." I wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to some misunderstanding or gossip. But there was something about the way Mike said it that planted a seed of doubt in my mind. "You're my best friend, Mike," I said, my voice low. "If you know something, you'd better tell me. Right now." He met my gaze, his expression pained. "I don't know for sure," he said again. "But if I find out anything concrete, you'll be the first to know." The rest of the night passed in a blur, the conversation awkward and stilted. When I got home, Samantha was already asleep, her phone charging on the nightstand. I looked at her, peaceful and oblivious, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. The days after Mike's vague warning felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. I wanted to believe Samantha was the same woman I had trusted for years, but a gnawing doubt had burrowed into my mind. I found myself watching her more closely, noticing little things I had once ignored. It started with the way she hesitated when I asked about her day, like she was mentally editing her response. Then there were her sudden absences, errands that lasted longer than seemed reasonable, and work events that hadn't existed before. Still, I had no solid proof, and I didn't want to accuse her without it. Mike hadn't brought it up again, but I couldn't let it go. The tension was eating me alive. So, one Friday evening, I decided to confront him directly. I invited him over under the guise of watching a game, and as soon as we sat down with our beers, I went straight to the point. "Mike," I said, keeping my tone calm but firm, "you said you'd tell me if you found anything. So, did you?" He looked uneasy, glancing at the TV as if it could provide an escape. "James, I don't know how to say this," he started, "but, yeah. I've heard enough to know something's not right." I set my beer down, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" He hesitated, then leaned forward. "A buddy of mine works security at that fancy restaurant downtown, the one Sam loves. A couple of nights ago, he saw her there with a guy. They weren't just having dinner, James. He said they looked close. Holding hands, leaning in, the whole thing." The room seemed to tilt. "Who?" I demanded. "Who was she with?" "I don't know," Mike said quickly. But my buddy said it wasn't the first time he'd seen her there with someone. He thought I should know because of us. "Because of us?" I repeated, confused. Mike's face turned red, and he rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, James. Because I've been with her too." The words didn't register at first. They hung in the air like a bad joke, waiting for a reaction. When I didn't respond, Mike continued, his voice cracking. "It was a mistake, okay? It only happened once, about a month ago. We were drunk, and I don't even know how it started. She told me it didn't mean anything, that it was just a stupid, impulsive thing. But now, after hearing about her at the restaurant, I'm not so sure." I stood up, the beer bottle slipping from my hand and clattering onto the floor. "You slept with my wife?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Mike said, standing as well, his hands raised as if to calm me. "I swear to God, James, I didn't want to hurt you. I've been feeling sick about it ever since. That's why I told you to pay attention." I thought. I thought maybe it was just me, but clearly, there's more going on. My mind was racing, a chaotic mess of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. Get out, I said through gritted teeth. James, please. Get the hell out. I shouted, pointing to the door. Mike hesitated for a moment, then grabbed his jacket and left without another word. As the door slammed shut behind him, I stood there, shaking with rage. My best friend and my wife. The two people I trusted most in the world had both betrayed me, and now I was left to pick up the pieces. That night, I didn't sleep. I paced the house, replaying every conversation, every moment that suddenly felt like a lie. How many times had Mike been in my home, sitting on my couch, laughing with me while carrying that secret? How many times had Samantha looked me in the eye and lied? The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let them control the narrative. If Samantha thought she could keep lying to me, she was in for a rude awakening. I needed the truth, and I was going to get it. I started by calling the restaurant Mike had mentioned. It didn't take long to confirm his story. The hostess I spoke to remembered Samantha and her companion, a man who fit Mike's description of a well-dressed professional in his early 40s. She even offered to check their reservation records for me, which revealed a pattern. Samantha had been there multiple times over the past few weeks, always with the same man. Armed with this information, I decided to take things a step further. I went to the restaurant that evening and waited outside in my car, watching the entrance. Sure enough, Samantha showed up just after 7 p.m., dressed to the nines and looking happier than I'd seen her in months. She wasn't alone. The man with her was tall, confident, and clearly comfortable in her presence. They walked into the restaurant together, laughing and talking like a couple on a date. My stomach churned as I watched them, the reality of her betrayal sinking in deeper. I stayed there for over an hour, long enough to see them leave together. They didn't go far, just a few blocks down the street to a boutique hotel. I followed at a distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. When they disappeared inside, I knew there was no denying it anymore. Samantha wasn't just cheating, she was living a double life. I drove home in silence, my mind racing with plans for what came next. This wasn't going to end quietly. I was done being the fool. The following day, I decided it was time to confront Samantha. The anger inside me had grown into something I could barely contain. I'd spent the night organizing every piece of evidence I had, the reservations from the restaurant, the details Mike had provided, and my own observations from the night before. There was no way she could talk her way out of this. I waited until she got home from work, pretending everything was normal as she walked through the door. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, the same casual affection she'd given me 1,000 times before, but this time, it felt like a slap in the face. "How was your day?" she asked, setting her bag down on the counter. "It was fine," I said, keeping my tone steady. "How was dinner last night?" Her hand froze mid-reach for the water bottle she'd been about to grab. She turned to look at me, her smile faltering. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean," I said, crossing my arms. "You went to dinner with someone last night, didn't you?" Her eyes widened, and for a split second, I thought she might come clean. But instead, she shook her head. "James, what are you talking about? I was at work late." I laughed bitterly, pulling out the printouts from the restaurant reservations and tossing them onto the counter. "Don't lie to me, Samantha. I followed you. I saw you with him. And I know this wasn't the first time." Her face went pale as she stared at the papers, the weight of her lies crashing down around her. "James, I can explain," she stammered. "Explain?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You've been sneaking around behind my back for weeks, maybe months, and you think there's an explanation that will make this okay?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "Don't give me that," I said coldly. "You didn't mean for it to go this far? So what, you accidentally went to a restaurant with him? You accidentally checked into a hotel? Stop insulting me, Samantha." She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. I wasn't happy, she cried. I didn't know how to tell you. I felt lost. Lost? I repeated, my anger boiling over. You didn't feel too lost to plan dinners and hotel nights. You didn't feel too lost to keep lying to my face every single day. So don't give me that excuse. She didn't respond, just stood there crying, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. For a moment, I thought that was it, that I'd gotten everything out of her. But then I remembered Mike. And what about him? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. What about Mike? Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face filled with panic. James, please, she whispered. I can explain that too. Explain it, then, I said. Tell me how my best friend ended up in your bed. Tell me how you could betray me twice over with the two people I trusted most. She hesitated, clearly trying to find the right words. It was a mistake, she said finally. We were drunk, and it just happened. I felt so guilty afterward, James. I swear, it didn't mean anything. Nothing, I said, my voice trembling with rage. It meant nothing to you, but it meant everything to me. Do you have any idea what it feels like to find out the two people I trusted most were sneaking around behind my back? To have my entire life turned into a joke? I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said, my voice cold. Sorry doesn't undo the lies or the betrayal. Sorry doesn't make me trust you again. She collapsed into a chair, her hands covering her face. I don't know what to do, she said, her voice muffled by her sobs. You're going to pack a bag, I said. And you're going to leave. Tonight. Her head shot up, her eyes wide with shock. James, no, she pleaded. Please, don't do this. Let me fix this. Let me prove to you that I can be better. There's nothing left to fix, I said flatly. You made your choices, Samantha. Now you have to live with them. She tried to argue, but I cut her off. I don't want to hear it, I said. You're not staying here another night. This marriage is over. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face a mixture of shock and despair. Then, slowly, she stood up and headed to the bedroom. I watched as she packed her things, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and sadness. This wasn't how I had imagined my life turning out. But as I stood there, watching her carry the last of her bags out the door, I knew I was making the right decision. This wasn't about saving the marriage anymore. It was about saving myself. When Samantha walked out of the house that night, it wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. She may have thought that leaving would smooth things over, that time and distance would give her a chance to spin the situation into something more sympathetic for herself. But I wasn't going to let her escape accountability so easily. The first step was dealing with Mike. I'd spent the days since learning about his betrayal vacillating between wanting to slap him and cutting him out of my life entirely. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that silence would give him an easy out. He needed to understand exactly what he had done and feel the consequences of his actions. I showed up at his apartment unannounced, banging on the door until he opened it. He looked like he hadn't slept, his eyes red and his hair disheveled. James, he said cautiously, stepping aside to let me in. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. Sit down, I said, my voice cold. He obeyed, sitting on the edge of his couch like a scolded child. I stood in front of him, arms crossed, staring him down. I want to hear it from you, I said. Every detail. No lies, no excuses. Tell me what happened with Samantha. Mike swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. It was one time, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I swear, James. It was just one time. Why? I demanded, my voice rising. Why the hell would you do that to me? I don't know, he said, shaking his head. We were drunk, and she started talking about how things weren't great between you two. I wasn't thinking, and it just happened. That's not good enough, I snapped. You don't just accidentally sleep with your best friend's wife.
You had a choice, and you made the wrong one. He nodded miserably. I know.
I hate myself for it, James.
I've been sick about it ever since.
Good, I said.
You should be. But feeling guilty isn't enough.
You don't just get to apologize and move on like nothing happened. I'll do anything to make it right, he said desperately.
You can start by staying out of my life, I said. I don't want to see you, talk to you, or hear from you ever again. We're done, Mike. His face crumpled, but I didn't care. He had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. I walked out without another word, slamming the door behind me. With Mike out of the way, my next focus was Samantha.
While she was out of the house, she was still entangled in my life, financially, socially, and in ways I hadn't even considered until now. I started by locking her out of our shared accounts. She had access to everything, credit cards, savings, even the utilities, but I wasn't going to let her use another dime of my money to fund her escapades. I called the bank and froze our joint accounts, then opened a new one in my name. I transferred my share of the savings and canceled every card with her name on it. Next, I dealt with the house. Samantha had insisted on keeping keys when she left, claiming she might need to retrieve more of her belongings later. But after what she'd done, I didn't trust her. I changed the locks and installed a new security system, making it clear that she wasn't welcome back without my permission. Once I had taken care of the practical matters, I turned my attention to exposing the truth. Samantha had always been careful about her image, going out of her way to maintain a picture-perfect facade for friends and colleagues. But I wasn't about to let her lie her way through this. I reached out to a handful of mutual friends, people I knew would appreciate hearing the truth before Samantha could spin her version of events. I didn't embellish or exaggerate, I simply laid out the facts. She cheated on me with 2 people, I told them. One of them was Mike. The reactions ranged from shock to outrage, with several people expressing their support and cutting ties with her immediately. Word spread quickly, and it wasn't long before Samantha's carefully curated social circle began to crumble. The final step in my plan came when I learned that Samantha's new companion, the man from the restaurant, was married. I hadn't been sure at first, but after some digging, I found his wife's contact information. It wasn't an easy decision to make, but I knew she deserved to know the truth as much as I had. I called her one evening, my hands shaking as I explained who I was and why I was reaching out. She was quiet at first, but as I shared the details of what I'd seen, her silence turned into anger. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice cold. "I had a feeling something was going on, but I didn't have proof. Now I do." "I'm sorry you're going through this," I said. "Me too," she replied. "But at least now I can deal with it." By the time Samantha found out what I had done, her world was already in shambles. She called me, furious, accusing me of trying to ruin her life. "You did that yourself," I said calmly. "All I did was tell the truth." Her rage quickly turned into desperation, begging me to stop, to let her move on in peace. But I didn't owe her peace, not after what she had done to me. When the dust finally settled, I felt a sense of satisfaction. Not because I had hurt her, but because I had reclaimed control over my own life. Samantha had taken so much from me, my trust, my peace of mind, but she wouldn't take my dignity. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Samantha was out of my life, and I had taken the first steps toward moving forward. It wasn't easy, and I knew there was still a long road ahead. But at least now, I was walking it on my terms. It was a month after Samantha left the house when she reached out again. For weeks, she'd tried to call and text, leaving voicemails that I ignored and messages I deleted without reading. I had no interest in hearing her excuses or letting her claw her way back into my life. But this time, her message was different. "James, I know you don't want to talk to me, but I need closure," the voicemail said. "Please, just meet me once. I won't ask for anything else." I almost ignored it, but part of me was curious. What more could she possibly have to say? I agreed, reluctantly, and told her to meet me at a small diner we used to go to when we were first dating. It wasn't a sentimental choice, I picked it because it was public and neutral, a place where I could leave without hesitation if the conversation went sideways. She arrived on time, looking smaller and more subdued than I'd ever seen her. She was dressed simply, her usual polished appearance replaced with something more restrained. As she approached the table, she hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether she was welcome to sit down. "Go ahead," I said, gesturing to the seat across from me. "Thanks," she said quietly, sitting down and clasping her hands in front of her. I didn't say anything, letting the silence settle between us. It was her meeting to call, her conversation to lead. She fidgeted under my gaze, then finally took a deep breath and started speaking. "I don't even know where to begin," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know I can't fix what I've done, and I know I'm the last person you want to hear from. But I needed to say, I'm sorry. For all of it." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "What are you sorry for, exactly?" I asked, my tone colder than I intended. She flinched at the question but didn't shy away from answering. "I'm sorry for lying to you," she said. "For betraying you, for betraying us. I'm sorry for hurting you and for ruining what we had." I nodded slowly, her words washing over me without much impact. "And?" She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "And for Mike," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. "That was... I don't even have words for how much I regret that." I scoffed, shaking my head. "You regret it now because you got caught," I said. "If Mike hadn't told me, if I hadn't caught you with the other guy, would you have felt guilty then?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe not. Maybe I would have kept lying to myself and telling myself it didn't matter. But it did, James. It mattered, and I hate myself for what I did to you." Her voice broke, and I saw tears welling up in her eyes. But I didn't feel sympathy, not anymore. I'd cried enough for both of us in the weeks since this all began, and I wasn't about to let her tears sway me. "So, what do you want from me?" I asked, my tone flat. "I don't want anything," she said quickly. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or to try to fix things. I know I don't deserve that. I needed you to know that I see what I did. That I understand how much I hurt you." I studied her for a long moment, trying to decide if her remorse was genuine. It seemed like it was, but I wasn't sure if it mattered. "And what do you plan to do with that understanding?" I asked. "Because it doesn't do me much good now, does it?" She nodded, wiping at her eyes. "I know," she said. "I know I can't undo the damage. But I want to be better. I don't want to be this person anymore." "That's your journey, not mine," I said. "If you want to change, good for you. But don't expect me to be a part of it." "I don't," she said quickly. I wanted to say it out loud. To own it. To take responsibility, even if it's too late. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Finally, she looked up at me, her expression raw and vulnerable. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" she asked. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "Forgiveness isn't about you, Samantha," I said. "It's about me. And honestly, I don't know if I can forgive you. Maybe someday, but not now. Right now, I just want to move on." She nodded, her shoulders sagging as if the fight had gone out of her. "I understand," she said. "Thank you for meeting me. I know you didn't have to." I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "Take care of yourself, Samantha," I said. She stood as well, hesitating for a moment before walking away. I watched her leave, her figure disappearing through the diner's glass doors. As I sat back down to finish my coffee, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. The conversation hadn't fixed anything, but it had given me a sense of closure I didn't realize I needed. Samantha was no longer a looming presence in my life, she was just a part of my past. I paid the bill and left the diner, stepping into the crisp evening air. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe freely. Samantha's chapter in my life was closed, and now, it was time to write a new one. Walking away from that diner, I knew the hardest part was behind me.
The confrontation, the evidence, the endless nights of self-doubt and anger, it was all out in the open now. What lay ahead was a clean slate, but it wasn't without its challenges. The first few weeks after our last conversation were a mix of small victories and difficult realizations. Samantha had vacated my life, but the remnants of her betrayal lingered in unexpected ways. I'd find myself second-guessing people's intentions, replaying old conversations, wondering if there had been signs I'd missed. Trust didn't just rebuild itself overnight. I poured my energy into regaining control over my life. My first step was reclaiming my space. The house we'd shared, once filled with memories of our life together, felt like a stranger's home. Her touch was everywhere, the furniture she'd picked, the photos on the walls, even the scent of her perfume lingering in the closets. One Saturday, I decided enough was enough. I spent the entire day tearing through the house, packing anything and everything that reminded me of her into boxes. The framed photos went into storage, along with the gifts she'd given me over the years and the decorations she'd insisted on buying. I replaced them with things that felt like me: art from a local gallery, a new set of dishes, and even a comfortable recliner for the living room. By the end of the weekend, the house felt lighter, more like a reflection of who I was without her. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Work became another anchor for me. I threw myself into my job, taking on extra projects and volunteering for tasks I might have avoided before. My focus shifted from simply getting through the day to excelling, proving to myself that I could thrive on my own. But the social aspect of my life was harder to rebuild. Samantha and I had shared the same circle of friends, many of whom had been blindsided by her betrayal. Some reached out to offer support, while others faded away, unsure how to navigate the awkwardness of the situation. I didn't blame them. Still, I knew I couldn't isolate myself forever. I started reconnecting with old friends, people I'd lost touch with over the years. One night, I met up with a college buddy I hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Over beers and laughter, I realized how much I'd missed the easy camaraderie of those friendships. "Man, it's good to see you again," he said, clinking his glass against mine. "You look like you're finally coming up for air." "I think I am," I admitted. Despite my efforts to move forward, there were still moments when the pain crept in. I'd hear a song that reminded me of Samantha, or I'd see something online about Mike and feel a flash of anger. But those moments became less frequent with time, and when they did come, I let myself feel them without letting them consume me. One of the biggest lessons I learned was the importance of boundaries. Before all of this, I had been the kind of person who avoided conflict, who let things slide to keep the peace. But Samantha's betrayal had forced me to confront the consequences of ignoring red flags and staying silent. Now, I was different. I spoke up when something bothered me, stood my ground when necessary, and didn't let guilt or fear dictate my decisions. It was a tough adjustment, but it was worth it. 6 months after Samantha left, I found myself in a completely different place, mentally, emotionally, and even physically. The house was finally my own, my career was thriving, and I was starting to enjoy the idea of a life that wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations. Then, one day, I ran into Samantha at the grocery store. It was the first time I'd seen her since our meeting at the diner. She looked different, more subdued, less polished. She smiled awkwardly when she saw me, her cart half filled with groceries. "James," she said, her voice tentative. "Hi." "Hi," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. Finally, she broke the silence. "You look good," she said. "Thanks," I said. "You too." She hesitated, then said, "I just wanted to say. I'm glad you're doing well." "You deserve it." "Thank you," I said. "I hope you're doing well too." She nodded, her smile faint. "I'm trying," she said. "Take care, James." "You too," I replied. As she walked away, I felt a strange sense of closure. The encounter wasn't dramatic or emotional, it was just two people acknowledging the end of something that had once been their whole world. In the weeks that followed, I realized that I didn't think about Samantha much anymore. She had become a chapter in my life, not the whole book. And while the scars of her betrayal would always be there, they no longer defined me.
One evening, as I sat on the porch with a drink in hand, I thought about everything I'd been through, the lies, the anger, the heartbreak. It had been the hardest period of my life, but it had also taught me lessons I wouldn't trade for anything. I learned how strong I was, how much I could endure, and how important it was to trust myself. I learned that no one, not even the people you love most, can take away your sense of self unless you let them. And most importantly, I learned that life goes on. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready to face whatever came next, not as someone defined by their past, but as someone who had survived it. The storm was over. And I was finally free.